Hi everyone, this is Kina Wolfenstein, and you're listening to the Complex Trauma Recovery Podcast. This series of episodes, I'm interviewing different therapists about experiential and bottom-up therapy, trying to help people feel more informed about different kinds of therapy and more empowered to find really awesome trauma-informed care. So I'm really excited about today's guest. I'm interviewing Kendyl. A lot of you probably follow her on TikTok. She's the Ennui therapist, ENNUI _ therapist on TikTok. I've always loved her content, learned so much about her content, so I'm super excited to interview her today. And this is her bio. Kendyl is a mental health therapist who specializes in complex trauma and dissociative disorders. She graduated from Naropa University with a degree in transpersonal counseling psychology. She utilizes a variety of therapeutic approaches, including EMDR, brain spotting, comprehensive resource model, IFS, coherence therapy, and inner child/inner teen work. Kendyl currently owns her own private practice, Mindful Therapy, in Salt Lake City, Utah, which offers a variety of bottom-up therapy approaches. She is also the owner of Lifesome, which offers mental health resources for individuals and therapists, including online masterclasses, trainings, consultations, and mental health-related merchandise. So you guys are gonna love this interview, but before we jump in, just a couple announcements. I do have an upcoming workshop, May 7th, Intro to Experiential Therapy, which is designed for therapists that want to learn some kind of simple introductory techniques to practice from more of a bottom-up perspective. I also have a workshop available called Healing Modalities for the Painfully Self-Aware, more so for clients or for anybody wanting to learn about bottom-up healing and what it looks like. All of the resources that I have available are in my link tree, which is posted below in the podcast description. All right, enjoy the episode, guys. Thank you so much for being here, Kendyl. I'm super excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, I've been excited to talk to you too.
So I love all of your content on TikTok, and I'm always like seeing your videos, and I'm like, I want to ask her about that and about that. So it's like hard to decide where to start. So you also specialize in complex trauma, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So let's see, what are kind of the approaches that you tend to focus on the most with complex trauma? Like, I know we're kind of going to be weaving in and out of a few different things, but what are like those foundational pieces for treating complex trauma in your experience?
What do you mean by that?
Like, what are the modalities, the approaches, like what, because you were saying earlier that you kind of use like an eclectic blend of things. So what are like those different ingredients that you kind of blend together with clients?
Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. Most of them are like a combination of a lot of just bottom-up approaches. So I use a lot of inner child work. I use a lot of brain spotting, EMDR, comprehensive resource model, coherence therapy, IFS, and it becomes a melting pot of like kind of combining all of those.
Oh, that's such a great list. I love all of those. Okay, let's start. I guess we'll just kind of go into a few of those, kind of do a deeper dive one at a time. So I would love to start with talking about inner child work, because I feel like inner child work is something that has definitely gained more popularity in terms of people like talking about it online. But I also think that it's hard to imagine what that actually looks like in therapy for people that haven't tried it yet. So yeah, can you just talk a little bit about what inner child work is and what that looks like clinically?
Yeah. So when I look at inner child work, it's a type of parts work. And, I have all the different kinds of parts work I do. It feels like it just moves to like deeper layers. So I would probably, when I look at inner child work, it's like the top layer of, I'm typically working with an inner child or sometimes an inner teen. And then we're trying to work with what is the adult self. And mostly these are like the dominant parts of the inner child work. Is the goal is for the adult self to learn how to reparent the inner child.
Yeah. How do you get people in touch with their inner child or inner teens?
Um, experiential therapy.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of different ways in which we can. I typically use more of becoming more embodied in the negative core belief. So when I'm working with an inner child, I'm usually looking for a lot of the negative core beliefs that connected with the inner child. So if somebody comes in and they're like, they got slighted by their friends over the weekend and they saw all these pictures online, um, we might explore kind of like what core belief starts to come up for them when when that trigger happens. It might be like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't matter or I don't belong. And from that entry point, we usually kind of look at like, how old is this? And that goes into like feeling it in your body, the emotions that come up, how familiar is that experience?
Mm-hmm.
And then we just track of how old it is. And
Mm-hmm.
typically, core negative core beliefs typically form in pretty early childhood.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's usually the entry point that I find the easiest to start working with the inner child, of identifying the inner child.
Yeah, kind of through the core beliefs that come up
Mhm.
during like times of emotional activation.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. And I love those questions too, of like how old does this feel? How familiar is this? I use those a lot as well. And then once someone has kind of identified their inner child or teen or gotten in touch with it, what does the like building the adult self look like, or what does it look like to kind of facilitate that
Mhm.
reparenting?
Yeah, I use a lot of different experiential techniques. One of my favorite is kind of a bit of a time machine meditation or a time machine exercise where as we start to really get to the like core root of when the negative core belief started to form, it's leading questions of like, if we could go back, what would we want to do to, help this child not feel like they don't matter?
Mm-hmm.
And just prompts of like, and sometimes they're like, well, I don't know. So we'll pull it outside of them and like, okay, well, if there was a kid that you knew right now that was feeling like they don't matter, what would you want to do for them?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So we're kind of trying to facilitate that more nurturing adult perspective of how we would want to try to help. And this usually is the entry point of identifying the unmet needs of the inner child,
Mm-hmm.
which is
Yeah.
what we're trying to facilitate the adult self internally to be able to start giving them
Whatever those kind of core attachment
unmet
wounds
needs.
and unmet needs were.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that typically is like kind of looking at what we could have done or would have wanted to do for this like wounded self with this core belief.
Yeah. Have you ever found for people with complex trauma that it can be hard to get in touch with that adult energy? Like they can be really like blended, I guess, with that like wounded inner child energy and kind of have some difficulty finding that like adult resource within them.
Yeah, sometimes. And this is when like IFS comes in handy because some of the IFS work is learning the therapist kind of being a mentor of teaching how that would look like to help
Mm-hmm.
facilitate that that growth of the self. So sometimes as a therapist, I might have to kind of go, well, if little you was in front of me, this is what I would have done to help them not to feel like they matter.
Mm,
So I do
yeah.
a little helping facilitate that like nurturing awareness because if we look at it from an attachment place, the way we learn how to do this is typically from how our attachments help us learn how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I kind of am facilitating a little bit of that um, kind of attachment as kind of the co-parent.
Yeah, like modeling what that kind of security looks like.
Yeah, and then we might explore like if like maybe I would have wanted to like given more physical soothing that
Mm-hmm.
little inner child, and then I might check in with them like, do you think that that would have been helpful? So then they can kind of go, well, no, or they can say like, yeah, that would
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and then we can explore what that would look like in present day to give that soothing to them.
Yeah, yeah. I love those time machine exercises, like the going back to nurture, or I also have really enjoyed just going back to witness, because I feel like so often in complex trauma, people experience just so much like invalidation, or just, feeling very alone and unseen. And so sometimes I'll do exercises where we just go back in time and just kind of like witness what's happening, and just let the inner child or the inner teen know, like, I see you and I see what you're going through.
Yeah,
And I
I think that's a
understand.
really important like first unmet need is just
Mm-hmm.
to be validated. And that's like sometimes when people want to insert like positive core beliefs too quickly
Yes.
before the witnessing happens, it's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
you gotta slow that down.
Okay, I love that you brought that up, because that's something I think about all the time, is when we're working on, moving from like negative core beliefs to positive core beliefs. And I
Mhm.
do feel like some therapy tries to rush that process, or people feel pressure, to like rush that process. So yeah, what does that look like for you? Like, how do you know when it's time to start shifting a core belief versus like, how, when are you done with just kind of like the witnessing and the feeling
Yeah.
into it?
Well, that's a lot of like their client guiding me, letting me know. Like typically when we're exploring the negative core belief and doing a little bit more witnessing and validating, I actually will instruct them to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
Because their initial instinct is, what would you want to say to this kid who felt like they didn't matter? Is I would want to tell them they do matter.
Right.
Right. And I'll kind of check in, does that feel true to this part of you when you say that?
Mm-hmm.
And typically it's like, no, not at all. And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, so slow that down.
Yeah. Yeah. We're not there yet if it doesn't feel
Right.
true.
And
Mm-hmm.
it really does model. I don't know if I have mentioned much of this, but when I first started doing therapy, I was majority doing it with children.
Oh, interesting.
And so that's what I noticed with children when they would come in with like this kind of really negative belief that they were kind of showing me. If I, as a therapist, tried to kind of be like, I know, like, you matter, like, you matter to me.
Mm-hmm.
They would give me like a side eye, like, lady,
Right.
you don't even know me.
Right. Right.
And I realized from working with actual children, it's like, that's a slow trust building process
Mm-hmm.
to be able to kind of maybe reframe that of like, I know you don't feel like you matter, but I just want you to know you matter to me.
Yes.
And if the enough trust is established, they'll kind of give me a look. They'll give me like this subtle cue of like, okay, maybe
Mm-hmm.
like
Like,
they're
I can
not
receive that now because
right. They're
there's
not
more.
going to be
Yeah.
direct of like, in that way. You have to track them and kind of feel what that looks like. And I think that is similar to when I'm working with adult clients. I'm kind of trusting and assessing like how much trust building is going on internally,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to like even introduce the idea that maybe this core belief isn't true.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I feel like that, does it feel true, is probably one of the questions that I ask most with clients.
Very
Um,
coherence therapy.
yes, very coherent therapy. Like, what feels true here? And I think I was just talking about this on TikTok the other day, but I think that sometimes therapists or newer therapists, I'm sure that I have also done this at many times earlier in my work, where you want to like correct someone's shame, or you want to like
Mhm.
fix it in that moment, because you see someone that you care about and they're in all this shame and in all these negative core beliefs, and the instinct is to want to be like, no, 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 you're amazing, you're so lovable, you're so
Rescue,
worthy.
rescue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Rescue, rescue, fix, fix, fix. And it's just like so ineffective, right? And oftentimes could even like maybe shut that person down a little bit, or make them feel like, oh, okay, well, that doesn't change how I feel. Like, I'm still over here with my core beliefs. So what does it look like to not do that, right? What does it look like to be with someone in those negative core beliefs without trying to fix or rescue?
Yeah. Is that a question?
Yeah, that's a
Oh,
question.
okay. Yeah, it's what for me, what it's like is I call it this because this is what I would do with the kids that I worked with is like to build trust, first and foremost, like you have to, can I swear a little?
Oh yeah, you can swear.
Okay. You have to sit in the shit
Yeah.
with somebody. And you have to learn how to be regulated in sitting with the shit. Because
Yeah.
if a child is in my therapy office and they're feeling like they don't matter, they're pretty dysregulated with that belief.
Yeah.
And if I meet them with dysregulation, we're both just like there's there's like a lot of misattunement happening. And so learning how to sit in the shit of being regulated in somebody's like emotions that can be uncomfortable, like shame and despair, can actually be quite a healing experience for people.
Yeah.
And so that's first and foremost is like a lot of my own internal work and my own ways to keep myself regulated and not try to swoop in to fix it, because often that's because I'm uncomfortable with it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think learning how to sit in the shit has been like the most helpful learning curve for me as well. And sometimes I feel like it's hearing the core belief and it's saying, like, oh, yeah, like, let's just be with that and explore that together. Like, what does it feel like, to hold that belief? And where did you
Right.
learn that about yourself? And really just like spend some time there until it's been fully explored.
Absolutely. I it's it can we often want to rush that process.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um,
So how do core beliefs change? What actually facilitates a shift in core beliefs?
well, I mean, for me, it's incorporating that memory reconsolidation.
Woohoo! Memory reconsolidation. Yay.
Yeah, it's being able to kind of um, take that core memory that connects with the negative core belief, right? That schema,
Hmm.
and facilitate that memory consolidation so that we can like update it and edit it, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, okay, so yeah, I think we're leaning into the coherence therapy side of things here. So
See how this organically just shifts?
yes, and I mean I that's what I love about the work is like the blending of all these different things. And I
Yeah.
feel like when I'm in sessions with people, it's like weaving in and out of like IFS and somatic and coherence, and like it feels they all just work so well together. So
They really
I love that. So I just did an episode about coherence therapy. So if people have been listening, we don't need to kind of spell out like the foundations of
do.
how it
Right.
works, which is good.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like the pro symptom position of coherence therapy and what that looks like with complex trauma?
Hmm. What angle to kind of look at that with?
Any
Um,
angle you want.
okay. So the pro symptom is like the emotional reality. It's that the symptom that exists has like a deep emotional sense. It's like the
Mm,
person's meaning making.
mm.
And so when we're looking at the pro symptom, oh, so we're moving. Rephrase that for me.
Yeah, I guess I'll break it down into
Yeah.
smaller questions. So, what does it mean to be like pro symptom in sessions with
Okay.
clients?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So to be pro symptom in sessions means that we're actually kind of looking at the symptom from like how it has this benefited the system or a part
Mm-hmm.
versus like how do we fix it and correct it.
Mm-hmm.
Because most of our defenses, most of our kind of ways in which we protect ourselves has come from a place of like there was a purpose for it.
Yeah.
And the pro symptom is kind of looking at it from that lens of how has this served you? How has this helped you?
Mm-hmm. Assuming that, so if someone comes into session and they're like, I have really bad social anxiety, you're going to be like wondering, how did this person learn that social anxiety is protective in some way, or what is like the function of the social anxiety, instead of just like here's some tools for how to not be socially anxious anymore.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or the symptoms of that social anxiety you can look at too, right? Like how has that helped? Or how has that pattern been helpful?
the symptoms of the social anxiety, like for example, like hypervigilance or being super focused on other people's opinions or things like that.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like how you said emotional reality earlier. I haven't used quite that language for it before, but it's kind of like, yeah, there's like the kind of objective facts, like logical reality, but then we all have these inner worlds of our emotional realities, which are like
Mhm.
these networks of all of our different implicit learnings and like the things, the meaning making.
Right.
Um, so since this is like a theme with a lot of the people that listen to this podcast, have you worked with people that are very much like kind of the intellectualizers? Or I mean, I think a lot of people with complex trauma kind of get cut off from those emotional inner worlds, right? Like the emotional inner worlds are there, but there's been not really the space to like actually get in touch with those things or explore those things. And um if you're working with someone that is kind of like cut off from their emotional inner world, what does it look like to help them? I feel like the answer is just going to be experiential therapy, but more specifically, what is the process of helping someone get in touch with their emotional reality if they've been kind of cut off? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. So like when I'm looking at this, um with the idea that there might be a barrier there,
Mm-hmm.
part of what I kind of look at it from the lens of is a right brain, left brain disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a lot of like reading around how that happens. So what that indicates to me is that the left brain really had to take on a lot more to make sense of these emotional experiences, but
Mm-hmm.
it got caught, con disconnected from the right
Yeah.
brain. So it doesn't really have the full picture. It's like if you read the footnotes of a book versus reading the full rich book.
I love
And
that.
that's what the right brain gives us, the full richness
Mm-hmm.
of the information, where the left brain is like a cliff note. And so
Mm-hmm.
people often with complex PTSD had to disconnect and separate from that right brain experience because there
Yeah.
was no guidance in attachment of how to make sense of their emotions, how to regulate their emotions, how to make sense of why this situation brought up these emotions.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of left often on their own to figure that out, or they're kind of manipulated into a negative way of looking at what happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so when I'm looking at somebody who's very like frontal cortex processing,
Mm-hmm.
very intellectualizing, just gives me a compassionate sign of like, oh, this person really had to live in that part of their brain a lot more.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's trying to help bridge that gap of that right brain, left brain disconnect. And sometimes it very much at the very beginning is me reflecting the emotions, just like
Mm-hmm.
a parent would do with a kid, of like helping you make sense, helping you identify your emotions, helping you um, create context for this experience.
Mm-hmm. Kind of
Um,
almost providing that like reparative mirroring that could be missing in childhood development.
right. And then, as you know, with then as that kind of is getting a little bit more built, then we want to facilitate experiential therapy so that they can start to self-embody that more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes I feel like it's just a slow process. If someone has been kind of cut off from their emotional brain, like it's just like dipping your toes into the experience and kind of titrating the experiential stuff so it doesn't feel like too much too fast.
Yeah, exactly. Because all these defenses and what this disconnect was there for a purpose, right? There's a pro symptom to this.
Right. Right.
And so to try and get someone in there too quickly can actually be quite dysregulating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that was actually another question that I was gonna ask, which is about what I don't like the word resistance. I feel like it has this very like pathological connotation to it. But like blocks, barriers, when there is something in session that maybe would be labeled as resistance. What is like the kind of bottom up and trauma informed way to work with that. And it sounds like you're saying you work with that block or that barrier also from the pro symptom position, right?
Correct. Yeah. Like we're trying honoring, for me, it's honoring like how the system put into place, like its way to be able to continue to move on. And
Mm-hmm.
without trying not to pull out the rug from underneath that without being able to replace it with something, another thing, or really reprocess and update that we no longer need that.
Right. Right. Yeah, I feel like that's why some therapy that doesn't do that can be so re-traumatizing for people
Mhm.
with complex trauma because it's like kind of trying to take away these different protective defenses before anything else has been built up or before there's a felt sense of like, okay, I'm ready to let this go. So it can just be like even more like, and I totally know, it could be from like a well-intentioned clinician that just isn't informed about these practices. But for the client, it can be an experience of like all of my safety just being ripped away.
Yeah, exactly. And that can, I think that's part of the why experiential therapy is important because, well, all these modalities have certain ways of helping someone be more embodied, and also regulated in that being embodied.
Yeah, yeah. So the kind of like protective mechanisms that we're talking about here in IFS, those would also kind of be looked at in a particular way, right? As kind of the protectors in the
Mhm.
system.
Yeah, yeah. The different kind of manager and firefighters.
Yeah. Could you break down what managers and firefighters are?
Yeah, so managers are just protections that we put into place that are more day-to-day protections. The
Mm,
more common ones like our inner perfectionist, um, our inner critic, things that we're like, yeah, this is pretty common. I do this quite a bit.
mm-hmm.
Those kind of defenses are like usually managers.
Okay.
And then we've got firefighters when we have some kind of activation, some trigger that the managers can't fully like protect, and it's not as the whole system doesn't really know how to quite work with this.
Mm,
We move into more of a firefighter protection.
okay. So
And the
managers
firefighter,
more like day to day, firefighters more like when shit hits the fan or when things feel like really dysregulated.
right, and that's when we see maybe more addictive behavior happening or other ways in which we're trying to regulate that we might not consider to be like quote unquote adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that often are more taboo,
More
suicide
taboo
ideation.
defenses, like self harm or these kinds
Yeah.
of things.
And the difference, another difference is managers are a little bit more concerned with the long-term outcome,
Mm,
and firefighters are more like just needing to put out the fire. They're not really thinking about the long-term outcome of the protection.
yeah, more reactive kind of in the
Mhm.
moment. Yeah, that makes sense. Hmm. Okay, cool. And so I want to kind of pull in the attachment defenses stuff
Mm.
here too. So I talk about attachment a lot on this podcast. I feel like it's, pretty much always comes up with complex trauma or is like a central part of complex trauma.
It is
Um
because it's an interpersonal wound.
yeah, yeah. Because
Mhm.
most complex trauma is relational, right? Like it
Mhm.
takes place within primary relationships. And so those learnings have so much to do with like, what does it mean to be close to other people? And like, who am I in relation to other people? And so I think with attachment, like people generally have an understanding of, okay, so you might come into therapy and you're like, I have identified that I have this anxious attachment pattern or that I have a more like avoidant attachment pattern. And it's kind of it's someone reflecting on their relationships outside of therapy where they're like, oh, I want the therapist to help me with this. But one thing that I've seen you talk about on TikTok that I find really interesting is more so how attachment defenses actually show up like in therapy or even like
Mhm.
between the client and the therapist.
Mhm.
So what does that look like? What does it mean, for an attachment defense to be kind of playing out in the therapy setting?
Well, it's typically like you're starting to notice how a client. So when I'm looking at attachment defenses, it's that attachment paradox of my wound comes from where interpersonal. So when we're looking at from childhood, it's the caregiver child dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
or a care or a sibling or whatever, like it's really close in the family system. The interpersonal trauma creates this kind of tension of these two safety systems. One safety system is that defense of wanting to like protect ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
When we're getting abuse and neglect, we have a system that wants to fight or flight,
Right.
right? But then we also have a safety system of attach.
Mm.
And so we also have this instinct to want to go towards in order to be cared for and rescued.
Yeah.
So it creates this internal tension when the source of where I need to attach is also causing the neglect and abuse,
Mm.
right? So it creates an attachment defense because I have to connect and also disconnect.
Yeah. What a
And so
horrible like paradox and inner conflict to be experiencing.
right. And this is like the wisdom and the why it's so adaptable, these attachment defenses, because they will appear to be in connection while also disconnecting. And you can feel that in therapy if you're being able to track that.
Mm. Can you give
And
an example of what that might look like or how you might tell that that's happening?
yeah, so I think I just recently did one like on the fawn defense.
Oh, I saw that video. That was great.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
in therapy. And so, like, when I am working with somebody and I'm noticing a fawn defense, the fawn defense is wanting to attach through being like being wanted and being like worthy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll notice there's this, if a client is over apologizing to me, or if a client is sometimes idealizing the
Mm.
therapeutic relationship. A fawn response can also be a lot of relying on the therapist's perspective.
Oh, yeah. Like, what do you think I should do? What do you think is
Mhm.
best?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're in that kind of defense, the disconnect is we're shining a light on the therapist. And I'm actually feeling disconnected because I don't actually know what's going on with my client.
Mm.
So there's a lot of self-abandonment that I can start to feel that creates the disconnect of I'm actually not really getting to know my client. My client's starting to get to know a lot about me if I play
Oh,
into it.
that's interesting.
But I'm
Self-abandonment.
mhm,
Can you talk a little bit more about what that means?
self-abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this case with the fawn defense, all attachment defense have elements of self-abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
With the fawn defense, the self-abandonment is in order to appear connected, I need to focus on you and your needs and your wants. And I abandon myself in that relationship.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of loss of self here, of loss of like my own needs, my own wants, my own boundaries, my own emotional reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as the therapist, if a client is in that kind of fawn and self-abandonment defense, you might notice that it feels like the clients like you're almost talking about yourself or your opinions, or the clients are wanting to like focus more on you as the therapist rather than themselves.
Yeah, that's one way in which I can kind of feel that's happening is that
Mm-hmm.
there's this discrepancy in the connection piece, which sometimes therapists can kind of feel like, oh, they're really wanting to understand me. They're really wanting to like, I don't know, it's much more subtle than being really
Mm-hmm.
obvious that the light is being shined on me.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know what you mean for sure. Because there's some clients that don't have that defense at all, where it feels like the sessions really get to like it's easier to have the sessions be like really centered and focused around the client. And then there's other sessions where you feel a little bit more of like a push pull or kind of like a tug between where the attention is going.
Yeah, and often with the fawn response, when we start to try to do deeper processing, I'll get to know more about the people in their life than them.
What
It'll
do you mean by that?
it'll almost feel like the like an example might be we start to look at interpersonal conflict with somebody that maybe stirred up them feeling frustrated and mad.
Mm-hmm.
But then throughout the session, I'll start to notice that I'm learning more about the person they're having conflict with and
Oh,
their experience
yeah.
than I am my client's experience in that
Yeah,
relationship. Like I
totally.
start to get to know everything about the other person and what they've been through and their emotional reality than my
Right.
client's emotional reality.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. It's like that other focus kind of
Yes.
showing up.
Yeah.
That makes sense. So when we look at the different like nervous system states, because I feel like it's so cool how all these things overlap, but you're talking about fawn. So with like fight and flight and freeze, would you also frame those as attachment defenses, or can you also see those showing up in therapy?
Absolutely. So I see all fight, flight, freeze, collapse, and attach, cry for help, all in attachment defenses that show up in therapy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think the attached cry for help was a new one for a lot of people. I actually also had not heard of it until I saw you talking about that on TikTok. So
Oh, really?
yeah, I knew fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse. I hadn't heard of the cry
Oh,
for help. Can you teach everyone about that?
yeah. Yeah, the attach cry for help response is a really early, like our earliest adaptive way of surviving and feeling safe, which is that crying out for help to be rescued.
Mm,
So if you want to look at it from like a very instinctual, it's the baby who's crying.
yeah.
The parents come to tend to it, right? So it's this needing to be rescued and saved.
Hmm.
And when we've had attached, it's just one of our instincts of like how we can have an attachment defense. Um,
Yeah.
and so clients who often come in with an attached cry for help response are often coming in with a deep feeling of desperation and needing
Mm,
and a lot of helplessness.
mm,
And that combination of emotions could often be really triggering for the internal system.
mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of defenses that also connect with the attach cry for help response. Someone might then move into a fight defense or a freeze. Those are pretty common ones that connect with this.
Like because being in that attached cry for help state feels
Mm,
so vulnerable or so helpless, then the kind of more protective defenses of like shutting down might kick in.
right. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of shame that connects with being in that desperate, needy, helplessness state.
Yeah.
And that
Mm-hmm.
shame is a huge trigger for the internal system and internal protection. So often people can move into like the more shame attach rage cycle or move into a freeze mode
Mm-hmm.
quickly when this is activated.
Yeah. 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 I'm glad you brought up shame. Let's talk about shame. Do you find that that is also part of pretty much all complex trauma therapy? Like, is that a really, really common area that you notice in your work?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Like
Yeah.
for me, I can't you have to know how like to be aware of shame to
Yeah.
when you're doing complex trauma work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything has shame on it.
I know. That's what I find too. Yeah. What are some of the ways that that shame commonly shows up in doing this kind of trauma therapy?
I mean, shame can kind of show up in direct and non-direct ways.
Hmm.
Um, but when we're looking at, I guess when I'm looking at attachment defenses, the shame can look like all of them have an element of something that about my humanity that's not acceptable.
Mm,
And so when I'm working with shame, I'm often looking at what is the element that feels not acceptable about my humanity. What interpersonal like trauma was experienced around my humanity.
mm,
Um,
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So when you say like direct and non-direct, would direct be when someone can kind of voice clearly like I feel ashamed of this or like I feel like I'm a bad person or those kinds of things like it's more fully conscious?
Yeah, yeah. So that would be more obvious to me of like, okay, like they're pretty aware of this shame and it's pretty obvious that they like I hate the fact that I'm angry, right?
Mm,
Like I can pretty much start to look at like, okay, so there's some shame around the emotion and the emotional experience of anger.
yeah, like I hate this part of myself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Where indirect is more of just like if somebody didn't like that they were angry, but there is more of an indirect way of that being expressed. Like
Mm-hmm.
if I was really in a high fawn response often is trying to avoid that emotional experience of anger.
Yep, I found
But
that too. Mm-hmm.
right. Yeah. So but there's not a lot of awareness that like I'm just not an angry person.
Right.
Right. Like that's I'm just really chill.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit more indirect for me to kind of go, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
What would happen if you start being angry?
Right, right. And that's where a lot of the times you find like either the shame or the deeper fear. It's like, well, if I let myself feel this, then these would be the consequences, or that wouldn't be acceptable.
Right, right.
Yeah. So do you feel like shame is also a protective defense? Or like how do you conceptualize kind of like what shame is or like the role of shame? Does you know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Yeah, yeah, I do think that shame it can be very protective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like it helps us know what's not acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like if I got yelled at all the time or my was physically, mentally threatened by being angry, it's really helpful to have that kind of level of activation of shame to not like embody that for my own safety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So kind of protective, like could be protective in a family system where shame kind of creates like guidelines for what is and is not acceptable to kind of maintain safety or attachment.
Right. So it protects us from re-experiencing that painful disconnect, right? That
Hmm.
painful misattunement.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that is like a mental, physical, whatever, like there's a misattunement happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I also feel like sometimes shame can be defensive or protective as a way to hold on to those attachments because it's like internalized anger, right? Like it's taking like for someone that doesn't feel safe to be angry or to like their fight instinct is cut off and they're much more in that kind of like fawn
Mhm.
response. Shame is a way of like taking all those bad feelings that I have about these things that have happened and like internalizing them all so they're all about me and that way I can still like be in attachment with others, whereas if I were to be angry and I were to like externalize the shame I might actually feel differently about my caregivers or like people in my life.
Exactly. Yeah, it protects us from having to re-experience the disconnect, but also helps us from like to give us a certain sense of control to
Yeah.
that we may be able to reconnect.
Mm,
And also to help make sense of the disconnect.
yeah, to make sense of it because if you're like oh it's because I'm bad that it feels safer to just have a reason for it to have a way to make sense of it and for that reason to be kind of within my control because it's about me right because if I think that these things have happened because I'm bad that kind of puts it within my field of control.
Correct. Yeah, and I kind of refer to it creates a cycle of hope.
Mm,
It creates a cycle of hope because if there's a misattunement and a disconnect and it's somehow like due to me, there's a certain sense of control with that.
yeah,
And it gives me hope that if I just do this, that I can experience attunement,
yeah.
right? So like if I
Mhm.
have a disconnect with my caregiver, often this is connects with those negative core beliefs too. The shame does.
Yeah.
So the shame kind of manifests in that I'm not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Then if I have different kinds of strategies to prove I am good enough, maybe a stronger inner perfectionist starts to form.
Mm-hmm.
Then this gives me hope that if I just prove my worth, that I'll get that attunement again.
Right.
Creates a creates hope, and hope is really important in a hopeless situation.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And especially I can see why for a child, who has a parent that is like emotionally unavailable or disconnected, or inconsistent, unstable, that having that hope would be like really comforting versus if someone were to accept that this is not within their control and it isn't about them, that would create like helplessness or hopelessness,
Right,
which could be like
right,
really debilitating.
right. And then we wouldn't be able to continue to move on, and that kind of then connects in with like structural dissociation of the
Mm,
importance of like separating that so that we can continue on with daily life.
yeah, so that's the pro symptom of shame.
Mhm.
It makes so much sense. So as we're talking about this, I was thinking about grief and rage as being two like intense emotional experiences that we're often like avoiding, or blocking off with these different defenses. Because when I'm thinking about shame, I feel like there's a connection between shame and grief, or shame and rage, where it's like, oh,
Mhm.
if I were to let go of this shame, I would feel immense grief over what happened or the things that I missed out on in my childhood. Or maybe I would feel immense rage towards people that have, mistreated or abandoned me. Um, where do you find that grief and rage, or do you find kind of a similar connection? Like, what does that look like for you?
I mean, yeah, I do find that connection of like often shame, underneath shame is the things that I had to abandon in order to
Mm,
stay connected. So it's reclaiming those things, and it's a lot of the times it is like emotionality, like things about myself that were not okay.
mm,
And grief and rage tend to be things that are squashed out of us pretty early.
yeah.
Yeah, and so being
Mm,
able to reclaim them and own them. So when I'm doing like, especially when I'm doing inner teen work, there's a lot of reclaiming of the rage.
yes.
And I love it. I'm like, yes, finally we're reclaiming like anger. Finally we're reclaiming rage. 'Cause it's a
Mm-hmm.
very self-protective emotion.
Yeah. I love the work of getting back in touch with anger too. I love music for that as an
You
experiential thing. I know that you can do like
know, I do
somatic stuff,
too.
music. Yeah. Literally just the other day I was driving and I was like, I want to put on a really angry song and like scream to it in my car. And I did it and it always feels so good. It always feels, I
Yep,
think my inner teen loves it.
totally.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, so you said the things I had to abandon to feel connected, which I think is such a beautiful way to phrase it. Like it could be feelings that you have to abandon, like grief or rage, or it could be probably a lot of other things too that we might have to abandon in order to feel connected, right?
I mean, the list is endless
Yeah.
of what, interpersonal misattunement. What about me created some, like, what about me was not, the other person couldn't regulate with me in.
Hmm.
So like if my caregiver couldn't regulate with me in my anger, I'm gonna get cues that that's not okay.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's direct or indirect, we start to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, people have to abandon their assertiveness, their kind of individuality, their self-expression. I feel like a lot of the time it's different kinds of self-expression, and so all these different
Mhm.
parts of the self get kind of like stifled and suppressed.
Absolutely. Yep. So it's
Mhm.
like that's part of like when we're doing more bottom up approach in therapy, I think that one of the universal kind of um arching themes that all of them share is kind of trusting the client to lead.
Yeah.
of where this goes. So because it could go in so many different directions.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
And
no like formula or protocol for it.
right. And if therapists with bottom up approach often have to learn to kind of step aside
Mm-hmm.
and not always interpret and try to make meaning for the client,
Yeah.
they may then shift that direction of where that goes, and it might actually not be totally accurate.
Yeah. Totally, which I feel like is such a shift from a lot of the kind of standard training, kind of like a psychodynamic approach, or where it's like it's so much about interpreting and analyzing and kind of like making assumptions. And I loved that about coherence therapy, that they're really explicitly like, don't make assumptions, don't interpret, like just you're kind of feeling around with the client in the dark, and seeing where things naturally unfold. Because yeah, if we try to like step in and direct too much, and that's been a learning curve for me too. Like there's been times where I think I'm maybe predicting where something's going. I'm like, oh, this is where we're gonna go, or this is where we're gonna go, and maybe I'll try to nudge it in that direction. And I've learned from moments where a client is like, no, that's actually like there's a totally different thing coming up here, or like a totally different connection. And so yeah, learning how to really be not directing the process, I think, is super important.
Yeah, when I got trained in brain spotting, that was a huge emphasis of like, don't interrupt the client's process, use the wait protocol of why am I talking? They kind of have this concept of like the client is the head of the comment and you're the tail.
I like that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so I think I mean, all the modalities that I've trained in have that concept of like step out of the way, let the client
Mm-hmm.
be the expert, follow their lead. Um, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually like that, but it is hard for especially clinicians that are really used to being more in the driver's seat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, definitely. Um, wow. Well, this has been so helpful. I feel like I could pick your brain for hours. Is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you want to talk about, or anything else that you feel like is really important working with complex trauma that we haven't mentioned yet?
I think I would say overall, when we're looking at a lot of these different bottom up approaches and how they use experiential therapy, the way I usually look at the difference between experiential and I guess more of a top-down cognitive
Mm-hmm.
processing is that the trajectory is outward or inward.
Hmm.
So what I mean by that is like if we're looking at more of a cognitive processing, um, let's say we're using the working with the negative core belief of I'm not good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Cognitive processing will often be processing the trajectory will be outward, meaning like, okay, so I'm talking about different times in which I didn't feel good enough. You know, in college, I had the stats class that I was not doing well in. Maybe in my teen years, I had a really hypercritical soccer coach.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that soccer coach, like, he was mean to everyone. And
Mm-hmm.
that soccer coach also, like, would often just leave us all alone to try to figure out how to practice. So you can kind of see I am moving further and further away from the
The
I'm
internal experience.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty soon I'm like on a tangent.
Right.
And I think the more cognitive processing can move us out that way quicker.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like experiential therapy is really trying to keep it going, the trajectory going inward.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm not feeling good enough. And I do remember like this hypercritical coach. Okay, well, like when you imagine that hypercritical coach being next to you right now, like how does your body start to feel?
Mm,
Right. What emotions come up here?
right.
How
Right.
old are you feeling here? Like we are moving closer and closer and deeper into that not good enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Really kind of it's like the being within the experience or talking from inside of the experience instead of about the experience.
Yeah. And so I think
Mhm.
experiential therapy, like if I summed it up, it's helping the client become more embodied in
Yeah,
their experience with reflection.
right, right.
Because the reflection part is really important because that means there's regulation.
Right. You're not just experiential therapy is not just like, let's go right back to that like overwhelming emotional experience and just experience it. It's like, no, you're experiencing it with these kinds of different supports now, the support of the therapist, the kind of compassionate introspection. Like, is that right?
Yeah, yeah. Like there has to be a certain level of reflection because if we are just embodying it without the reflection, like that's probably not going to allow for memory reconsolidation.
It's just going to be kind of triggering. It's just kind of like bringing up a trigger.
Right. And so all of these modalities really do kind of, if I summed it up, help facilitate that, becoming more self-embodied with
Mm-hmm.
reflection. And the
Mm-hmm.
way they do it can look and feel a little different, but there's always elements of becoming more embodied in that experience and how to do that in a regulated way.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes so much sense. Um, and then this is just something that people ask me a lot, so I like to hear different therapist takes on it. How long should people with complex trauma anticipate spending doing this processing? Like people will ask me, like, is it months? Is it years? And I mean, I think obviously it depends and there's variation, but what have you found? Is it like widely variable, or is there kind of like an average timeline for doing this kind of deep trauma work?
Of course you would ask that. um, I here's something that I kind of think of when you ask that is like it also depends for me like what the goal of the client is.
Yeah.
Because like they might not like it depends on like where they want to go with this. I could go as deep as I could keep going deeper.
Yeah, totally.
So part of that is a collaborative experience of like, what is the goal here?
Hmm.
What does the, client want to like work on? And that'll give me a better idea of what that time frame looks like. But if somebody is like really wanting to get into that real deep memory reconsolidation work, really working on re the negative core beliefs.
Yeah.
Um, it just depends. I often look at it from the structural dissociation perspective too, of like if it's primary, secondary, or tertiary,
Hmm.
because each one of those just have different complex layers of self-protection
Yeah.
that it's gonna just take longer to untangle.
Yeah.
So, if tertiary for me, which is more of like OSDD, oh yeah, OSDD and DID, we're looking at like 5+ years.
Hmm. Yeah, that's what I heard from a previous guest with kind of dissociation specialty as well.
Yeah, and then like complex PTSD, it can look like up to three 3+ years, and then
Hmm.
if we're looking at primary, um, that really just depends on what trauma it is, if it's a single trauma, um, or if there's just not as much internal protections put into place.
Yeah. I feel like it can also vary based on the level of external supports that a client has in their environment too. Like if there's a lot of safety and connection in their present day life, I feel like that makes it quicker and easier to like integrate those kind of disconfirming experiences in order to do the memory reconsolidation.
Absolutely.
And if a client is struggling more in their present day with like isolation, disconnection, lack of support, that can make things a little bit more not impossible, but can add kind of some layers of challenge as well.
Exactly. And that's why I think it is a very collaborative experience with the client
Hmm.
because they might not be ready to do something because of those factors.
Right. Right.
Right. But it doesn't mean we can't do some work in the like during that. It
Hmm.
just might not be like they want to be doing X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, psychosocial and biofactors are always important to consider.
Yeah. Okay. Last question, just because you mentioned it, and I want to make sure everyone knows what it is. Can you describe structural dissociation?
Um, Yeah, structural dissociation is kind of a dissociative theory. Um, and it looks at like two action systems. The action system of defense, so that fight, flight, freeze that we use in trauma, and then the action system of daily life, so going to
Mm,
school, doing caregiving, work. Um, all of these two, when we aren't experiencing trauma, often work really well together.
mm.
They're more succinct and cohesive, and information is kind of being passed from, more integrated information is being passed from these systems.
Yeah, yeah. So structural dissociation is something that everyone with complex trauma experiences, or only some people with complex trauma?
I would say if you have complex trauma, there's some structural dissociation happening
Mm-hmm.
somewhere because complex trauma, ongoing trauma often makes it so that we have to separate from the ongoing trauma information that
Yeah,
can be integrated and continuing on with like daily life.
right, right. Yeah, because the trauma, being so chronic and recurring in complex childhood trauma, like life doesn't stop. And while you're dealing with maybe all of this chaotic and traumatic shit happening at home, you also have to like go to school or go to work or go be able to function socially. And so it's that kind of like compartmentalization, right?
Exactly. Yeah, like it's adaptive. We have to continue on. So if I'm in chronic stress, you know, that will make it so that it's really hard for me to continue to try and integrate that traumatic information, that
Yeah.
stress information. And so we have parts that start to, we call them EPs, emotional parts, that start to take on that information that is disconnected or dissociated from the part of me that needs to continue on with daily life. We're
Hmm.
trying not to have so many intrusions
Right.
upon the daily life movement
Right. Right.
activity.
Yeah, makes so much sense. Awesome. Well, those are all of my interview questions. Thank you so much again for sharing your time today. Um,
Absolutely.
are you accepting clients?
I'm not. I have a wait list.
Okay. I just
Yeah.
always ask because I know people hear these episodes and are like, can I work with her? But you do have a lot of amazing online resources, and I'm going to be linking your social media and website in the podcast description. So I've seen that you have, like, I think different classes and kind of training resources for like therapists. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's working with attachment defense with clients. There's core belief cards. So there's a few things that are like therapist resourcing, and then there are more like just individual resources as well, like the inner child masterclass and
Oh, cool.
the core belief cards to people by that aren't therapists because
Yeah.
it's helpful that way too.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kendyl.
It
Really
was so
appreciate
good
your
talking
time.
to you.